No questions about Mayor Rob Ford. I can explain many things, but I can't explain what's going on in Toronto today, even though it's my home city. But equally challenging and equally, I think, formidable challenge, comparable to what's happening in Toronto today, is really trying to explain the topic of the crisis of religion and politics in the Islamic world. That's my area of specialization. I spent most of my adult life writing and thinking about the topic, and I want to provide tonight an analytical framework, a historic approach to this particular topic. I give a lot of interviews to the media, and at most you're given a minute, maybe a minute and a half to explain what's going on in Lebanon, Syria, and you really don't have the time to develop a fully fledged and comprehensive answer to a set of political developments that have really shaped the Middle East, beginning, I think, starting in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. And so what I want to do today is really provide to you this framework of analysis, a historic framework that can help you better understand the crisis of religion and politics in the Islamic world today, focusing on the following question: what explains the rise of Islamic fundamentalism throughout the region over the last approximately 30 plus years? How can we make sense of that particular phenomenon? What's going on? What arguments can be advanced to make sense of this particular question? And so Joe is going to be helping me tonight to sort of advance the PowerPoint slide. So if you can sort of, you hit it twice. And it's not working as I feared. Let me just check and make sure you're pressing the right button there. And I think something was, okay, try it now. There you go. One more time. Great. Okay, so what's going on in the Middle East today, or in Muslim societies, that can help explain this social phenomenon? Why is there a weakness or a seeming absence of secular democratic opposition groups that clearly support a separation of church and state, that support Enlightenment values, and that respect individual rights and freedoms as we do in the West? Why are all mainstream opposition groups religious-based, Islamic-based? What's going on, and how can we make sense of this emotionally charged topic? Next slide. The critical question to sort of ask is, why are these things happening now? Is this sort of a set of developments that have been engulfing and dominating Muslim-majority societies for their entire history, going back 1,400 years, when Islam first emerged on the political stage? Or are these events, the crisis, the turmoil of religion and politics, a function of a particular moment in time, the convergence of a set of events that have produced this type of religious-based turmoil and responses to turmoil? Now, the standard view that you often hear is that the reason why there's a crisis of religion and politics in the Islamic world today, the reason why there's so much political turmoil, is because it has to do with Islam. Either its ideology, its text, its inner theology, something about Arab culture, something about the Quran perhaps. And there's often an assumption that if, for example, hypothetically speaking, the majority of the people living in the Middle East, if, hypothetically speaking, they were all Buddhists, we would not be having these problems. Now, that may be a simplistic and a soothing and familiar way to think about this topic, i.e. it's about Islam. But I would argue that's a very superficial and fundamentally flawed way of making sense of what's happening in the Islamic world today. Next slide, please, Joe. And so the Arab Spring, these series of events, these revolts, very much have placed the issue of religion and politics on the political agenda again. You saw in the aftermath of the elections that took place in Tunisia and Egypt the rise of religious-based political parties that came to power. Some of them that are still in power, some that have been toppled, and this has placed this question back on the international agenda. And so what I want to do is go back in history to explain sociologically, historically, and comparatively some of the background events that can explain what's happening today with the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, the rise of social conservatism, and also partially the rise of some manifestations of Islamic fundamentalism, the minority expression that is violent and militant. And I want to begin by telling you a story, a true story that took place not in the Middle East, but in the heart of Europe, approximately 500 years ago, in the German town of Munster. Next slide. Now, on the 25th of February, 1534, the German town of Munster was overtaken by Anabaptist zealots who established a radical theological dictatorship. Those who refused to undergo rebaptism were expelled without food or belongings in the middle of a snowstorm. A new regime reconstituted the local government by canceling all debts, burning financial records, and confiscating food, money, and other valuables. A new moral tyranny was imposed upon the citizenry, the most dramatic example being the burning of all books except the Bible. Blasphemy, seditious language, scolding one's parents, backbiting, adultery, and even complaining were now considered sins and punishable by death. Polygamy was instituted, and unmarried women were ordered to marry the first man that asked them. 49 women were executed and their bodies dismembered as a result of their failure to comply with this new law. A harsh dress code was also implemented. Houses were routinely searched and surplus food confiscated. It wasn't long before news of the town of Munster was to reach the outside world, and the Catholic bishop from the town of Munster, who happened to flee, leads a mercenary army that surrounds the town and puts a siege on Munster. Confusion and chaos soon take over the town of Munster as the siege begins to tighten. From within the Anabaptist rebel ranks, a new leader emerges, popularly known as John of Leyden. One of his first acts was to call a town meeting in which he proclaimed, quote, "God has chosen me to be king over the entire world. What I do, I must do because God has ordained me. Dear brothers and sisters, let us now give thanks to God." As the siege on Munster tightened and starvation set in, John retained power through periodic prophetic outbursts, often invoking religious scripture. When this was insufficient, outright terror and brute force were his modus operandi. All dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. After a failed coup attempt, John oversaw the torture and the beheadings of the plotters. Their bodies were buried in mass graves in the marketplace. Executions and dismemberments were frequent, and the bodies of the dead were often nailed to trees and gateways as a reminder to others. On the 24th of June, 1534, 4 months after the rebel takeover, the town of Munster was finally liberated. The Catholic bishop's troops capture John of Leyden alive, and over the next several months, he's led as a prisoner of war around the villages that surrounded the town of Munster, and then he's brought back to Munster. And in a public ceremony, he's tortured to death with red-hot irons. His body is then put in a cage and is suspended from the church tower in the middle of the city. And reportedly, if you go to Munster today, that cage is still there. Next slide. Now, recalling the Anabaptist Munster uprising is instructive in terms of shedding light on the contemporary problems of political development in the Islamic world. The Muslim world today is at the beginning of its 15th century of existence, or in comparison to the West, it's about 100 years before the time of Martin Luther, the key architect of the Protestant Reformation. Next slide. Now, Christendom in early 16th century, like Islam at a similar age in its historic development, was marked by intellectual, political, and religious upheavals. Sir Thomas More published his famous book, Utopia, in 1516. It reflected new Renaissance thinking by posing new questions about the relationship between church, state, and society. Around the exact same time, Martin Luther rebelled against the Catholic Church, an event which unofficially marked the beginning of Protestantism. Early 16th century Europe also witnessed the emergence of wide-ranging new scientific discoveries and overseas exploration as the modern era of capitalism and colonialism began in earnest. 25 universities were founded at this time, and the printing press had published over 10 million books in various European languages. Soon, the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation were to engulf Europe, dividing the continent both politically and religiously. Similarly, in the latter half of the 20th century, in the Middle East, this period has ushered in profound social and political changes in Muslim-majority societies. The ending of the era of colonialism saw the emergence of many nominally independent Muslim-majority states that had been marked by an abundance of military coups d'etats, interstate wars, revolutions, an oil boom, foreign interventions, high rates of population and urbanization, and critically, growing socioeconomic inequality. Now, the forces of economic and cultural globalization have significantly transformed the traditional way of life in Muslim societies, and coupled with the general absence of democracy, have produced numerous social pathologies, the most significant being the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. Historians who study this early modern period of Europe write and note consistently in scholarship that there was, quote, nothing very unusual about the rebellion that took place in Munster, or that it took the form of a religious protest movement. Similar events were common in medieval Europe. In other words, the Munster religious revolt was a sign of and a reaction to the changing times. A sign of and a reaction to the changing times. Similarly, the emergence of radical Islamist movements at the end of the 20th century in the Muslim world can also be understood in the same social and historic context. The parallels between these two time periods, early modern Europe, 16th, 17th century, late 20th century, Middle East, the parallels between these two time periods are worth emphasizing as a counterpoint to the widely accepted view here in the United States that tries to interpret the rise of political Islam as a function of some unique, peculiar ideology rooted in the alleged unchanging essence of Muslim societies. In reading about the zealotry of John of Leyden and his followers in Munster, Germany, one is reminded of modern-day Islamic fundamentalists, the Taliban in Afghanistan, Ahmadinejad in Iran, ultra-Salafist movements in the Arab world. The parallels are striking, and in many ways, the similarities between both groups outweigh their differences, both in terms of the political motivations, social origins, idiom of expression, and the religio-political context in which these actors lived. Now, when comparing religiously inspired protest movements in Europe in the 16th century with those in the Middle East, late 20th century, early 21st century, two observations are worth noting. Number one, democracy and human rights, it should be emphasized, democracy and human rights did not emerge from documents, but rather from struggles. Europe has indeed traveled a very long way over the last 500 years in terms of its own political development. Any objective attempt to explore the problems of democracy and political development in non-Western societies, in Muslim-majority societies, requires a rethinking and an appreciation for the very long and torturous development of democracy in the West. Be wary, in other words, of the tendency to read history backwards instead of forwards. What do I mean by that? There is often an implicit assumption here in the United States and in the West when it comes to discussing and debating the problems of democracy and unrest in the Islamic world, that somehow in the West, by comparison, we have always been liberal, we have always been democratic, and then you can draw a straight line from ancient Athens to contemporary Europe. But as the distinguished historian Mark Mazewer has noted in his important book, Dark Continent, Europe's 20th Century, it is wrong, he says, to see Europe as the natural home of freedom and democracy. Rather, the last 100 years in Europe was frequently a nightmarish laboratory for social and political engineering, inventing and reinventing itself through war, revolution, and ideological competition. Fascism and communism, Professor Mazur argues, should be regarded not as exceptions to the general rule of democracy, but as alternative forms of government that attracted millions of Europeans by offering different solutions to the problems of the modern world. By 1940, the prospects for democracy looked quite bleak, and Europe's future seemed to lie in Hitler's hands. I think these are sobering reminders for an American audience trying to make sense of international affairs today, particularly in relationship to the problems of non-Western societies. Allow me now quickly to turn to this question of modernization and its connection to this phenomenon known as Islamic fundamentalism. And by modernization, I'm simply using the term modernization as the replacing of the old with the new. Replacing of old patterns of thought, human organization, thinking, with new patterns of thought, human organization, and thinking. That's what the process of modernization in broad terms is really all about. Now, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism at the end of the 20th century was really a baffling development for many people around the world, and it seemed to confirm the worst prejudices and stereotypes that we had about Islamic societies and Muslims. Because after all, how could large numbers of people in the age of secular reason at the end of the 20th century identify with this socially conservative and sometimes militant form of religion as a key source of their identity? It did make sense. This development not only challenged the received wisdom of the European Enlightenment, but it also gave credence to an essentialist, simplistic, and reductive interpretation of Muslim politics. Professors Bernard Lewis at Princeton and Martin Kramer at Harvard are two social scientists who have worked and sought to interpret Muslim politics from this reductive form of analysis known as Orientalism. Now, the prevailing interpretation as to why fundamentalism has emerged in the Islamic world, but not liberal democracy, is often explained as a function of the peculiarities of Islamic civilization. Despotism, it is alleged, is at the very core of the Muslim faith, as it demands both submission to God and to those who rule in his name. If one reads, for example, the work of the popular author Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's a darling to many people in the West, among liberals and conservatives, one certainly gets this perspective. In an often cited cliche, Islam does not recognize, we are told, the separation between religion and politics, and it is a total way of life, the implication being that somehow a totalitarian system is the natural state of affairs for Muslim societies. But as Bernard Lewis, for example, writes, one reason for the absence of liberal democracy in the Islamic world is because in Muslim societies, from the very beginning, there were no independent groups that formed independent associations. Islamic law, Professor Lewis has once written, knows no corporate legal persons. Islamic history, he says, shows no councils or communes, no synods or parliaments, nor any other kind of elected or representative assembly. The political experience of the Middle East, Bernard Lewis says, under the caliphs and the sultans was one of unrelieved autocracy, in which obedience to the sovereign was a religious as well as a political obligation, and disobedience a sin as well as a crime. Martin Kramer, Professor Lewis's student, has sought to explain the political turmoil in the Middle East through a similar reductive approach. In discussing modern Middle East history, Kramer once wrote that of the many fundamentalisms that have emerged within Islam in recent years, perhaps none has had such a profound impact on the human imagination as Hezbollah, the party of God. In attempting to explain the political behavior of this particular militant organization, he wrote, quote, "More than any other fundamentalist movement in recent history, Hezbollah evokes the memory of the medieval assassins who were feared in the West and in the Islamic world for their marriage of fierce militancy and destructive deeds." Now, the linking of Hezbollah, 20th century terrorist militant organization, with 12th century medieval assassins that once existed is a typical interpretation of modern events used by this genre of scholars as if to suggest that the more complex modern forces of demographic shifts, economic disparity, cultural transformation, and foreign interventions are not worth taking into account. Now, Juan Eduardo Campo, in an incisive and acerbic response to Martin Kramer, has written, quote, "One can only imagine the objections that would be raised if a respected American studies scholar were to interpret Chicano or African American gang activity in American cities today in terms of ancient Aztec or African warrior religions, while neglecting to discuss the immediate social, cultural, and economic underpinnings of those activities." Campo's response, or Campo's comment here, and his emphasis on the modern socioeconomic crises of state and society in the Middle East and its relationship to the emergence of religious fundamentalism merits some consideration as an alternative reading to the problems of Muslim political development. Now, while fundamentalism is often considered to be an exclusively Muslim phenomenon, it's important to appreciate and to recognize that all major religious groups have experienced this form of socially conservative piety. The fact that it first emerged in the West, recall the story that I just told you of Munster, Germany, is not accidental. Given that it was in Europe and later in the United States where the process of modernization had its initial and most consequential impact. The momentous transformation of societies and cultures over the last 3 centuries has profoundly altered the way human beings relate to one another and view the world around them. In the 20th century in particular, there has been a discernible shift away from large extended families and a group-based identity toward a more individual-centered existence. This passing away of traditional society, the withering away of traditional society, has also included the weakening of parental authority, greater political rights for women, and the questioning and challenging of religious authority. While these trends are not visible in equal magnitude in every country around the world at the exact same moment, they do exist across the political spectrum and around the world in most societies, and they're deeply connected to what the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor has called the malaise of modernity. Modernity has been identified with an increase in social problems, such as higher divorce and crime rates, alcohol and drug addiction, nerve disorders, and family breakdown. This social miasma has given rise, in troubled times, to basic questions of identity that can help navigate an individual and his or her community through the troubled waters of the modern age. It's an observable fact that throughout human history, during times of great social transformation and political turmoil and upheaval, that a natural side effect is the revival of religion. During the Mongol occupation of Russia in the 13th and 14th century, for example, the Orthodox Church experienced one of its greatest periods of growth. A similar phenomenon took place in the United States in the mid-19th century with the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Stated simply, social upheaval engenders a reaction where people seek stability and security by a return to the basic and the familiar. Muslim societies are no different in this regard. Writing specifically about the Muslim reaction to modernity, James Piscatori has perceptively noted, quote, "Muslims are looking, in a sense, for what Daniel Bell once called new rights of incorporation, which link today's deracinated individual to a community and to a history. And yet, in another sense, they're also looking for old rights of incorporation that appear to be new even as they are familiar. Religion, precisely because in the past it answered questions about life and death and provided its followers with moral links to one another, becomes the means by which individuals hope to answer a new question of what it is to be modern, and in doing so to perhaps gain a reassuring common worldview. In this respect, born-again Christians and veiled-again Muslims are responding to the same broad phenomenon." Now, a common target for all fundamentalist groups in all religions is the concept of secularism, particularly the consumer-oriented culture of materialism that is identified with our secular age. These movements, these fundamentalist movements, tend to be literalist when it comes to interpreting sacred scripture, and critical readings of religious texts are viewed as heretical. To quote from a popular saying among Muslim fundamentalists, kullu bida'atin dhalala. Translation, all innovation is forbidden. What fundamentalist groups in all religions seek to do is to drag God from the sidelines and to place religion at the center of social and political debate. Every fundamentalist movement that I have studied, notes the former famous author and public intellectual Karen Armstrong, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is rooted in a profound fear of annihilation, in a conviction that somehow the liberal secularist establishment wants to wipe out religion. This is true of militant Christian groups in the United States, as it is of Muslim extremists in Egypt and in Iran. The need to, quote, defend religion is a common refrain espoused by these fundamentalist groups, indicating a deep belief that they feel that their religion is under attack. Quote, fundamentalists believe that they're fighting for survival, and when people feel that their backs are to the wall, they can often lash out violently like a wounded animal, notes Karen Armstrong. Secondly, it's important to point out that fundamentalist movements are evangelists in the sense that their primary audience are members of their own faith who've deemed to have gone astray. They're not generally interested in global conquest. They're against the idea of pluralism, generally speaking, in matters of faith, believing that there's only one correct school of interpretation of religion, scripture, and law. All these fundamentalist groups have this in common. Specifically, it's important to point out that these fundamentalist movements are not traditional in the sense of trying to roll back the clock and to live in a pristine age completely disconnected from modernity, like the Amish Christians have done, or like Hasidic Jews have done. But rather, most mainstream fundamentalist movements are very modern, both in terms of the values that they are reacting against and in terms of their very comfortable use of modern technology, their support for post-secondary education, and their urban lifestyles. This is most apparent in the educational backgrounds of many of the adherents of these fundamentalist groups, who tend to come disproportionately from the applied sciences, engineering, and medicine, where the answers are precise and the formulas are exact. Ambiguous meanings, multiple correct responses, shades of gray, and appreciation for nuance is not part of their intellectual or professional training. And their response to contemporary social and political questions is often informed by this cognitive rigidity. In commenting on the parallel processes of the rise of religious resurgence or fundamentalism in societies around the world, it is often noted by scholars that globalization has an important role to play here. In other words, the more that we are aware of the plurality of people and groups on the planet, this forces the question, what makes me distinct? How is my community different? And this has forced an upsurge in the rise of particularist movements. This precise topic was actually the subject of a very popular book about 20 years ago by Benjamin Barber called Jihad versus McWorld, where he argued that the rise of ethno-religious nationalism at the end of the 20th century was a reaction to the increasing political, economic, and cultural interdependence of our planet. Now these, I think, political, sociological, and historic insights suggest the need for a longer-term perspective on the problems of democracy, political turmoil, and how it relates to Muslim-majority societies. And so a brief word here about modernization in the context of Islamic societies. As I indicated already, modernization itself, the transformation of a traditional society into a modern one, is in and of itself a traumatic process. It should not be forgotten that the West took several hundred years to develop its secular and political institutions, much of it by trial and error. The wars of religion, political persecution, genocide, the Industrial Revolution, the exploitation of workers, the rise of nationalism, World War I, World War II, resulted in profound changes in all spheres of life, political, economic, intellectual, and religious. Today, I'm arguing that we are witnessing a similar process of transformation in developing societies with its concomitant destabilizing effects. But it's also important to appreciate, when discussing modernization, that in the context of the Muslim world, the modernization process has been very different than it has been in the West. Unlike in Europe, where modernization was largely an indigenous process, deeply connected to political and intellectual and moral transformations coming from within civil society. In the case of Muslim majority societies, modernization was state-imposed in an accelerated process to play catch-up with the West. In other words, the modernization process in the Muslim world was one of imitation, not internal social transformation from below. Muslim societies in the post-colonial period have largely been split into two camps. A Western elite that has received some sort of Western-style education and who have internalized secular values, and a large majority of the population that has not. Many regimes are ruled by an aging gerontocracy of men, some which have been toppled as a result of the Arab Spring, many which stay in power. Political change, as I suggested, has always been top-down, authoritarian, forced on a traditional society. Just to give you one example, in 1935, the modernizing king of Iran, a man by the name of Reza Shah, or Reza Pahlavi, who was sort of a miniature version of Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, wakes up one day and he decides he wants to do something for Iranian women. And he literally gives the orders to his troops to go out onto the streets of Tehran and to remove at bayonet point the veil from the heads of any woman that they happen to see. If you read the political memoirs and stories of women at this time, this was deeply shocking. This was like forced nakedness. Many women did not go out of their homes out of fear of encountering a police officer. This type of forced modernization has had consequences. It has produced a backlash. And one of the consequences of forced modernization policies has been the rise of a religious opposition movement, rejecting the modernizing, authoritarian, and draconian policies of the post-colonial secular state. It's against this backdrop, ladies and gentlemen, that I think we need to situate and explore the emergence of Islamic fundamentalism as a historical phenomenon. This is not the first time in human history that societies that are undergoing intense periods of social change have encountered socially conservative and sometimes militant religious movements seeking stability and order. Western observers of the Middle East, American observers of the Middle East, need to overcome your amnesia about your own Western history and recognize distinct parallels between what's happening today in the Middle East and the early phases of modernization in the West. In the post-9/11 euphoria about the superiority of Western values, it's often forgotten that Western history did not begin with human rights, democracy, and free markets, but rather their origins lay elsewhere. Now, Michael Walzer, the prominent philosopher at Princeton University, wrote his doctoral dissertation at Harvard on the Puritan Revolution in England in the 17th century, a period of intense social and political turmoil. And he provided a framework for understanding what he called the Revolution of the Saints, a study in the origin of radical politics. And it's in pursuit of this thesis that I want to turn to by way of concluding this lecture. Now, Michael Walzer writes this book called The Revolution of the Saints, focusing on the early modern period of England, 16th century, 17th century England. And he talks about this period as a period of intense social transformation in England, marked by population growth, rural to urban migration, and a receding feudalism. In covering this period, Walzer describes the following problems plaguing England in the 16th century that provided a fertile soil for the emergence of Puritanism. There was the problem of rural depopulation, vagabondage, excessive poverty due to rapid population growth that set and dislocated men from the rural countryside in which they lived and turned them into beggars who were wandering the roads of England. For over a century, Walzer notes, these beggars literally formed a distinct social community, completely alienated from the world on whose fringes they dwelt. Other men, driven from the land, poured into the cities of England where they were newly subject to calamities of depression and urban unemployment. This development, this rapid urbanization that was taking place in England in the 16th century, led to the intensification of plague, the dangers of plagues and fire. It brought new men into London who could not be absorbed into the existing civic institutions. And it was in the midst of this crisis that Walzer notes that Puritanism flourished in the cities, but especially in the suburbs. In the records of local churches, recent immigrants often turn up as members of a sectarian Christian religious sect. Deprived of village solidarity, disoriented in the great crowds, many men, Walzer notes, must have found solace and comfort in Puritan faith, and even, he says, in Puritan discipline. On a related note, Walzer discusses the problem of the religious vacuum that took place at this time period. That was a result of the slow decay and the abrupt collapse of the old church. At a fairly early point, both in London and in the countryside, this religious vacuum was filled by Puritanism, as once again, for many men, Puritanism provided an alternative set of social and political activities. The political turmoil, the political order at this time, was ripe with corruption, nepotism, and anarchy. Driven by a militant religious fervor, the Puritans and their Calvinist ideology sought to bring order and stability to their society by overthrowing the corrupt establishment and beheading the king. If you know your English history, the reference here is to King Charles I and the English Revolution, or the English Civil War. Now, these religious saints that Michael Walzer talks about were motivated by two things: a fierce antagonism to the traditional world and the prevailing pattern of human relationships, and a keen and perhaps not unrealistic anxiety about alleged human wickedness and the dangers of social disorder and breakdown. The religious saints attempted to fasten upon the neck of all mankind a new political discipline. In assessing the behavior of this particular phenomenon in England, the rise of these religious saints in the context of a changing Europe, passing through the phases of modernization, Walzer describes the religious saints and the Puritans as, quote, an agent of modernization, an ideology of the transition period. An agent of modernization, an ideology of the transition period. Near the end of his book, Walzer attempts to link his case study of English Puritanism to other countries and other cultural contexts and other societies that are undergoing rapid, intense social change. He writes that the Puritan concern for discipline and order is not unique in history. Over and over again, since the days of the religious saints, bands of political radicals have sought anxiously and energetically and systematically to transform themselves and the world in which they lived. The key development that gives rise to the rise of these militant, socially conservative actors is the breakdown of the old order. The breakdown of the old order. The choice of religious sainthood in such circumstances, Professor Walzer, distinguished professor at Princeton, notes, seems reasonable and appropriate. And in light of the above discussion, he says, given similar historic circumstances, Frenchmen and Russians would make similar choices. Englishmen became Puritans and godly magistrates, elders and fathers, in much the same way, he says, and for many of the same reasons as 18th century Frenchmen became Jacobins and active citizens, and 20th century Russians became Bolsheviks. Echoing these sentiments discussed above by Michael Walzer, these sentiments have a direct connection to the Middle East and the rise of political Islam. And Walzer notes, perceptively, quote, in different cultural contexts, in different moments in time, sainthood will take on different forms, and the saints will act out different revolutions. But the radicals' way of seeing and responding to the world will almost certainly be widely shared whenever groups of men are suddenly set loose from old certainties. Puritanism, therefore, provided what may be called an ideology of transition. It was central to the process of modernization in Europe, not because it served the purpose of some universal progress, but because it met human needs during a time of social and political upheaval. During more tranquil times, when a semblance of peace was restored to the land, The radical ideology of the religious saint no longer had popular appeal, and they gradually disappear from society. In the context of 17th century England, Walzer writes, after the restoration of the British monarchy, the energy of Puritanism was drawn inward, its political aspirations forgotten, and the radical religious saint gave way to the nonconformist. Or, he concludes, Lockean liberalism provided an alternative political outlook. This suggests only that these problems were limited to the time of breakdown and psychic and political reconstruction. When men stopped being afraid, Puritanism suddenly became irrelevant. And it's a main argument for my presentation this evening that the political modernization of the Middle East has produced similar forms of radical politics akin to English Puritanism, French Jacobinism, and Russian Bolshevism. One example that I can point to where you can see this battle playing itself out is in the Islamic Republic of Iran right now, where you have radical revolutionaries who are trying to stay and hold on to the old ideology of the revolution that was a byproduct of the failures of modernization under the Shah, and reformists, moderates, a new group of people who are battling it out for the future of Iran. And there's many other examples that I can cite. Now, to the extent that Walzer's model here is valid for understanding the process of modernization in the Middle East, this would suggest that the actual content of the ideology of these political actors is less important than the enveloping social, political, and historic context that sometimes produces sociologically a transitional force of religious saints during times of political turmoil and disorder. I think one of the benefits of recalling Walzer's thesis is that it provides an alternative framework of analysis to the popular thesis here in the West that emphasizes the sacred rage of Islam and the inherent clash of civilizations due to some alleged inherent Islamic hatred for the West. Walzer's paradigm is useful also because it forces American observers, Western observers of the Muslim world, to recall your own history of political development when violent periods marked the transition between tradition and modernity. Let me just conclude with a few quick thoughts that I think an audience such as yourself should try to keep in mind as you make sense of this part of the world. Number one, I think it's important to resist the easy temptation to generalize and to view the Islamic world and the 1 billion plus Muslims who live on this planet as a monolith. The tendency to look at the roots of political turmoil in the Islamic world due to some medieval Muslim problem rooted in some unchanging cultural essence is as problematic and as misguided, as I suggested earlier, as if we wanted to look at the roots of Latino and African American gang activity today in American cities by going back to ancient Aztec and African warrior religions. In other words, while history does affect the way people act in the present, history does not absolutely or unequivocally determine what will happen in the future. In other words, we're not prisoners of our own historical experiences. There are other intervening variables. Secondly, the development of democracy and human rights, as I tried to convey to you tonight, is a historical process that is evolutionary and gradual. Democracy, in other words, requires patience. Let us not forget that here in the United States, one of the oldest democracies in the world, that in this country we maintained the legal institution of slavery for the first 90 years of the American Republic, while simultaneously laying claim to being a democracy, and that it took another 100 years before African Americans could achieve meaningful levels of civil rights protection, and another 50 years after that before the United States of America was willing to elect its first African American president. In the same vein, let us not also forget, in thinking about this question of democracy and change and how long it takes, that it is wrong to call the United States a democracy prior to the year 1920, when women were given the right to vote and half the population was legally disenfranchised. So let me end this lecture tonight this attempt to interpret the tumultuous politics of the Islamic world today by quoting from one of my favorite Middle East historians. Professor Richard Bullitt at Columbia University has given these questions much longer thought than I have, and in speaking to a group similar to this one in New York where he lives, he offered the following note of caution. Quote, "Notions like human rights, equality, and civil liberties did not come from documents. They came from human struggles. Anyone who's aware of the feminist movement in this country can see such a struggle taking place, a struggle that has yet to succeed, but that probably will in time. Struggles cannot be fought. Struggles cannot be fought from the outside. They must occur internally. What struggles will take place within the community of Muslims, I would not hazard to say, nor would I venture an opinion as to whether the Muslims of the 21st century will follow the direction of the West in their controversies over political and social norms, or whether they will find unique solutions to unavoidable contradictions. Either way, conflict, diversity, and evolutionary change seem inevitable despite the powerful appeal of a traditional core of norms and values." Thank you for your attention.
We did 3 years in Saudi Arabia. Do you have a particular bent on why they are so conservative?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. Saudi Arabia represents a small part of the Islamic world, but a very important part at the same time. It represents the most socially conservative, puritanical interpretation of Islam. Why that's the case, you know, we'd have to have another lecture here to go into the roots of it. But the fact is that this is a part of the world, a small part of the Islamic world, but because it's the place of the holiest cities in the Islamic world, and because Saudi Arabia is a major oil exporter, there are very negative consequences that has flowed from the intersection of this socially conservative interpretation of Islam and the marriage of oil. Saudi Arabia has spread this interpretation of Islam throughout the Islamic world with very corrosive effects. A large part of the ideological militancy that we see at the root of Al-Qaeda in Iraq today, in parts of Syria today, come out of a particular puritanical, intolerant interpretation of Islam. The roots of it has to do with certain tribal sort of configurations. Saudi Arabia is a tribal society, it's a desert society. And so that's just an unfortunate fact, but we cannot understand the corrosive effects that Saudi interpretations of Islam have had on the region and on our world without being honest about the very negative relationship that has existed between the House of Saud and the United States of America. The United States of America has been, since World War II, the biggest backer, supporter, sustainer of the Saudi royal family. There's been no serious attempt to really push the Saudis, to hold them accountable for their despicable human rights record, for the way they treat their women, and for their production and projection of this radical interpretation of religion. And so much of the problem is an internal Saudi problem, but since we're here in the United States, we have to also ask ourselves, what role has the United States played over the last 60, 70 years in terms of sustaining that regime? How has our tax dollars gone to, how has it been spent in the context of Saudi Arabia? Has it been spent to try and produce, push, support more democratic forces, support human rights activists, or has it been really to support the Saudi royal family because they maintain a certain price of international oil, they buy our arms, they create jobs, and then we're happy with that arrangement? Well, if you're happy with that arrangement, then you also have to accept the negative side of it, which is this particular variant and interpretation of Islam continues to proliferate and continues to have very negative consequences. And I suspect that, you know, one of the last places in the Islamic world where you're going to see a major transformation in the direction of democracy and human rights is going to be in Saudi Arabia. But the good thing about it is that the Muslim world is much bigger than Saudi Arabia. The other end of the spectrum is you had Indonesia, which people often forget is a Muslim-majority society and has made pretty good inroads over the last 10 to 12 years in the direction of democracy. If you rank all the Muslim-majority countries, Indonesia is way ahead of other countries. So, you know, it's a mixed picture, but Saudi Arabia is a problem, and it'll continue to be a problem for the foreseeable future. And so there's responsibility to go around, and we in the United States here are not innocent in terms of what's happening in Saudi Arabia, because we effectively have been the protectors, the guarantors of that royal family and their stranglehold on that society.
Next question.
Yes. I perceive a rise of fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, occurring in the United States, a substantial rise of that. And the Tea Party may even be part of that, that we're experiencing. Does that fit into the theme and theories that you were developing here?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. When you talk about this whole question of fundamentalism and its rise, one of the anomalies, one of the big sort of issues that has to be interpreted is, why is the United States so very different from other modern, liberal, post-industrial societies? Why is religion, why is religious fundamentalism such a major force here at the societal level? Well, you don't see that in Canada, you don't see it in Europe, you don't see it in Australia. What's different? And so there's various explanations and theories here for why you have a difference. One is that, you know, you go back to the early American Republic. The United States was founded by sort of persecuted religious sects. Immigration, the way immigrants have come, they've sort of reinforced a certain religious tendency within American societies. But one of the arguments that I think is most appealing in terms of trying to understand the question of religious fundamentalism in all societies, one thing that it has in common, sociologically speaking, is its relationship to insecurity, its relationship to vulnerability. The absence of a social safety net, the absence of a social welfare state is connected often to the search for answer, the search for meanings. And because the United States is very different than other Canadian, Western European societies in terms of it doesn't have the same type of generous social safety net, people rely on or turn to religion as a refuge, as a source to fill in that void, to provide a particular source of security when the government or the state level governments are unable to sort of meet their needs. In other words, the whole question, some people have even drawn a connection. It's very relevant to what's happening here in the United States. The absence of a universal health care system. That there are millions of Americans who, if they're sick, you got to sell the house, and if you don't have a house, you're in trouble. You turn to religion. You search for some alternative answers. That fact in and of itself, the connection with insecurity and vulnerability and its rise to Islamic, and its rise to religious fundamentalism, there's a relationship there. I think that's distinct about the United States. If you want to sort of separate what the United States has and what it doesn't have from other modern liberal democratic societies. There's much more to the story than that. It's not my area of expertise, but I think just as someone who's thought about this question, I think there's something there in this question of, you know, the vulnerability, the insecurity that many Americans, who particularly are poor, who don't have alternatives in terms of, you know, a social safety net, they turn to religion, they rely on religious groups who sometimes fill in a void, and you see that as a parallel to other societies that have also experienced an upsurge in fundamentalism, this insecurity and vulnerability, and then the connection to religious identity and religious affirmation.
So another question on this side,
Sure.
and then I'll get over to that side.
Can you help us understand the conflict between the Sunni and the Shia?
Yeah.
Is there any correlations between what we saw in Ireland between the Catholics and the Protestants?
Yeah, well-
Is it economic?
Yeah. Well, yes and no. I think in the case of, for example, Iraq today, where there's a major civil war brewing, you didn't really have a conflict between Sunnis and Shia until after the American invasion and after basically the destruction and the chaos that characterized the post-Saddam era and that coincided with the American occupation. What you had is a scramble for political resources, for representation, and you had a completely upturning of who was in power and who wasn't in power. Historically speaking, in the case of Iraq, it was the minority Sunnis that were in power, or at least their representatives. and the majority Shia, about 60%, were out of power. As a result of the toppling of Saddam Hussein, Shia political parties came into power. They had the numbers. That sent shockwaves throughout the Sunni community. They weren't in power. They were scrambling for resources. So broadly speaking, in most of these societies, if you want to look at it, for example, in Iraq today, as one example, the fundamental battle, like in Ireland, was battle over representation, access to resources. But extremist groups will try and mobilize their constituency by playing on sectarian themes and ideology that go back deep into the religion, to try and defame, denigrate, undermine the religious integrity and identity of the opposite group, dehumanize them, which then makes killing them much more easier if you're not sort of, you know, and so that is part of the political dynamic. But you speak to a very important question, because right now, as a result of Iraq, more recently Syria, Lebanon to a certain extent, but also because of a geopolitical rivalry between Iran, which is majority Shia, and Saudi Arabia, which is the guarantor and the self-proclaimed protector of Sunni interests, you have a regional dynamic engulfing the Middle East and starting to tear it apart that revolves around this Sunni-Shia axis of conflict. The conflict in Syria now has taken on a certain dimension of Sunni versus Shia. Fundamentally, the problem in Syria is not about political theology. In the same way in Ireland, it really wasn't about political theology. It was about representation, discrimination. And in the case of Syria today, you know, the vast majority of the population, about 70%, are Sunni. The ruling regime is an Alawite branch of Shia that's in power, and they don't want to share power, and they're crushing the opposition. And so people are being mobilized around their sectarian identities. Fundamentally, it's important to, I think, challenge the notion that you hear in the United States that this is just a theological conflict. People are fighting wars that go back to the 7th century. Wrong. People are really fighting for rights, for democracy, for representation, and they're using their individual sectarian identities to mobilize their own populations. And some politicians and some regional states are abusing those identities to project and advance their own interests. And so fundamentally, the way that this gets solved is the way that sectarian problems of power get resolved in most democratic societies. You have to have a process of reconciliation, a process of democracy, an equitable distribution of the resources, a way of bringing the different parties to the bargaining table, guaranteeing that their basic rights as a community will be protected. And you have to push forward that way. You have to have conflict has to stop. You have to stop arming these people. You have to stop the violence. You need a ceasefire, and then you need to bring responsible people to the table. In other words, in the context of a democratization process where you can fundamentally deal with these questions. And the Middle East is not the first part of the world, the only part of the world that has dealt with this problem of sectarian divisions and sectarian rivalries. And so, but we're still very far away, a long way away from sort of having these issues resolved. In some countries, there's been more headway, in other countries less. So I think that's really what's happening. So there are parallels to Ireland. But of course, you know, there's also a lot of differences as well. And I think one has to be aware of both the similarities and the differences.
Next question, Dr.
You remind us that Western culture, and indeed many cultures, should recall their history of turbulent transformation from tradition to modernity. And we can certainly do that through the wonderful tapestry that you've laid out for us, and other scholars who are also aware of this history. You mentioned briefly Indonesia. I think that there are also a couple of other countries that have figured it out. What I mean by figured it out is to accelerate that process of transition. And I don't necessarily mean transition to modernity, but transition to the success of a state and some of the adoption of Enlightenment thought, perhaps tolerance, and so forth. But job one, it seems to me, is to produce a success and a state that is a success. For example, the history that I might read, or all of us might read, is available to those people who are now going through the transition. Is it conceivable that the process can be accelerated by them reading history as well as we?
Really good question, and I appreciate the comments on my talk. But my answer to your question, unfortunately, is no. Reading history is really the work. Reading history and then learning lessons is really the work of intellectuals. And intellectuals are in and of themselves a small percentage of the population. They can learn and sort of have an appreciation for history and perhaps try and pass those ideas on. But my sort of study of the modern Middle East is that even though, for example, Turkey has been much more advanced politically than other countries in the Arab world, and even though Turkey borders the Arab world, to try and go into Egypt today, or Iraq today, or Syria today, and say, look how Turkey has been relatively successful in terms of their democratization process. You should follow in their footsteps. That's much easier said than done, particularly when it comes to questions of religious identity, how to find the proper role of religion in government. I mean, it's easy to say that, look, you have to separate religion and state, religion and government. The Turks have did it, people in Europe have did it, they're much more successful that way. You can say that, but because religion, as I stated in the talk, is a marker of identity, it's so deeply ingrained, it's manipulated and used as a tool for mobilization by political actors. To say that just follow somebody else's history, even if it's a neighboring state, sounds like an easy prescription on paper, but it rarely works in practice. Societies have to go through their own learning experience. The best way to do it is to try and support the social conditions that allow for people to have an open public sphere, a vibrant public society, agree on the rules of the debate, allow people to have a discussion, an argumentation, elect people to office, and if they fail, then you elect someone else who can perhaps meet the needs of the constituents that are in that, in that community. So there's no quick fixes here. There's long evolutionary change. We have to think about political change in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, not in terms of months or years, but in terms of decades. That's how political change, meaningful political change, took place here in the West. It's going to take that long in the Islamic world. And largely speaking, there's not much we can do about it. What we can do is ask ourselves, to what extent has U.S. foreign policy, as the major power in that part of the world post-World War II, to what extent have we been on the side of meaningful, democratic, peaceful political change? And to what extent have we been on the side of supporting authoritarian regimes, like Saudi Arabia? I mean, that's what we're responsible for, because our tax dollars are going to support and has predictable consequences. The rest of those internal debates, unfortunately, we can talk to them, we can have cultural exchanges, we can sort of do what you suggested, learn from our history, but societies have to go through their own learning experience. Just to cite one example, it's a point that's not often appreciated. One of the areas that I study is modern Iran. You would be surprised today, as devastating and as negative as the 1979 Islamic Revolution was in Iran, it's been incredibly a learning experience for a generation of Iranians. There's a very deep-rooted indigenous, secular movement in Iran that comprises not only intellectuals, but many religious-based people who have learned, as a result of the Iranian Revolution, that the close encounter and melding of religion and politics is a disaster. The young generation of Iranians that I speak to and that study and speak are incredibly sophisticated, incredibly sort of desiring of a more moderate, and rejecting the 34 years of revolution that has been forced on them. If they ever get a chance to, manifest their voice, and they sort of did if you sort of follow Iranian politics in the last election. Elections in Iran are not free and they're not fair, but sometimes there's a range of debate. The one candidate that represented a complete rejection of the 8 years of Ahmadinejad, who campaigned on a reformist platform, captured the attention of many young Iranians. They voted for him, to the disgruntling and to the anger of the establishment in Iran. But that process of revolutionary change in the case of Iran has been incredibly educational for this new generation that has been born in Iran. The vast majority of Iranians are under the age of 35, born after the revolution, know nothing about the pre-79 period. Their entire reference point is what has happened over the last couple of decades, and every time they're given a chance to express an opinion, they express an opinion for reform, for moderation, for democracy, and for engagement in the West. So 34 years may seem like a long time, but in the history of political change, it's not that long. And I'm actually cautiously optimistic about Iran and where it's headed. The rulers in Iran are living on borrowed time. They know that time is against them. They know that their own population, their young people, reject their political values, which is why the Islamic Republic spends so much time on censorship, on arresting journalists, intellectuals, on freaking out if someone has access to Facebook. And so that eventually is going to change. The one irony here, and this is important because we're speaking here in the United States, the one thing that can save the Islamic Republic of Iran is an American or an Israeli military strike, which the regime will love in a certain sense if it doesn't hurt them too badly, but they will use that to rally opinion and rally the nation around the threat of external intervention. So Iran is one, I think, society that has gone through a learning experience where it's produced an indigenous movement for secularism, for democracy, for reconciling tradition with modernity, and it's one of the bright spots if the opportunity presents itself, and I predict that it will within the next 5 to 10 years. So that's one example. You have to go through these processes yourself. You can't just read it in history. I wish it was that easy, but unfortunately it's not.
Another question?
Yeah, you know, we're talking tonight about turmoil that arises out of periods of transition, and this was absolutely fascinating to me. But you know, and we think of that in terms of, well, you know, we're here, and yes, we have. I think Bill Schoberlein raised a very interesting question about why we're having the turmoil and the Tea Party issues in this country, and in talking in the context of the Middle East. But you know, the entire world is facing a permanent period of transition with climate change that is going to be bigger than anything we're talking about tonight. And what kind of an effect is that going to have on these so-called even stable countries? And that, I think, is going to overshadow all of this. So I think we have to think about, in terms of the types of transitions that are facing all of us and the whole world are huge. And I don't know what we can do about it, but hopefully not have. But from what you're saying, there's a good chance we will have the kind of turmoil that's going on in the Middle East. And maybe the Tea Party issues are in fact related. Maybe even in the Middle East, some of that is related to the uncertainty of what's going to happen over the next few hundred years.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that you said. Sounds like more of a comment than a question, but I agree. The more that there's uncertainty, the more that there's chaos, the more people search for answers, the more people will look for alternative sort of worldviews. So it's something to watch out for down the road, and it can have deep consequences. But I think we're a little bit too early yet to sort of make any conclusive sort of judgments about what will happen. But yes, if the prediction that you has sort of does manifest itself, then we're all in for very difficult times.
The microcosm of Libya is pretty small. They were held from 1911 to the end of World War II by the Italians. King Idris, who was the chief of the Senussi tribe, then became the king, and everything was wonderful. I arrived there in 1957 and left in 1961, and it was remarkable. And I'm trying to figure out how the people of Libya allowed Gaddafi to take over.
Well, as you know, Gaddafi wasn't elected by the people of Libya. He came to power as a result of a military coup. And then once he came in power, he didn't leave power until there was an uprising, very much a byproduct of the Arab Spring and very much a byproduct of the support that Europe and NATO gave to the revolutionary forces. So the response to your question is that Gaddafi, like Assad today in Syria, like Saddam Hussein in Iraq, like many of the current heads of state, including Mubarak in Egypt and the current military rulers, they're all in power because of the force of the gun, not because of the popular support or legitimacy that they have in the eyes of the people. And that's a source of grievance that in and of itself produces turmoil and chaos because of that repressive political context, which is what the Arab Spring was very much all about. And, you'd have to invite me back for another talk to give you a sense of where the Arab Spring is today and where it's headed. But that's my quick response to your question.
One final question in the center, and then if you still have some questions, you might have a chance to stick around a little bit.
About your comments about the West's the West's perception of Islam to be interesting, and particularly given the fact that I'm guessing fundamentalism represents a tiny part of Islam, the people of Islam. Particularly in the West, where is the outrage from the Muslim moderate? Why don't we hear more from moderate Muslims about what's happening in the world, particularly in the West?
You often hear that question. Where are the voices of the Muslim moderates? they're there. If you haven't heard them, then the problem is not that they don't exist. I would argue the problem is that they don't get access to mainstream media. So just for example, I get this question often. You know, I don't have it, the list of Muslim organizations, political leaders, and American Muslim organizations that have condemned 9/11. The list is very long. They've condemned it. One of the arguments that you hear is that somehow there's an absence of Muslim moderates. One of the problems is that there's a perception problem. Muslim moderates don't often make the news. It's the radical fundamentalists who are blowing up things and attacking American targets who tend to get a because the news, that's the nature of the news. What's exciting? Some group of Muslims are peacefully holding a vigil in some part of North America to condemn what's happening in Afghanistan today. They're generally not going to make the news. So the claim that somehow there's no Muslim moderates and why are they silent is, I think, not a fair accusation or comment to make. Now there is an element, I think, and I've been involved in this debate living in sort of Canada up until 9/11, shortly thereafterwards. Muslims up until 9/11 generally were very reluctant, and I was involved in some of these internal debates within the Muslim community, to speak out and to condemn acts of extremism. They were reluctant. Some people did speak out, others did not. One reason is because a lot of Muslims in North America are new immigrants. They are vulnerable economically. They feel a sense of sort of alienation here. But you see in the second generation, those who've been born and bred here in the United States, a much more willingness and engagement to sort of take advantage of the opportunities to speak out and to engage in American politics and to sort of take a much more principled position. People who are new immigrants to a society, I don't have a lot of expectations from them, particularly if they come to the sort of poorer parts of the world. And I'm talking about Toronto, where I came from. There was a lot of Somali, Indo-Pakistani immigrants who were sort of, middle class, lower middle class. So, I mean, there's an element of truth to that. But I think when it came to 9/11, the big transformative event, all major American Muslim organizations did speak out. Now, the flip side of that is what Muslims say to Americans. Where are the American moderates when it comes to acts of violence and acts of discrimination and massive human rights violations that take place that injure and hurt the feelings of Muslims? For example, how many American politicians, American Christian organizations spoke out and condemned the human rights violations that take place in the West Bank and Gaza? Just to cite one example, there was an attack, a war in Gaza in 2008. About 1,500 Palestinians were killed, 300 of them children, by phosphorus gas. Some of that supplied, most of the arms supplied by the United States, and every single American politician was outdoing themselves to prove that they were more pro-Israel than the next politician. There was no empathy for the suffering of the Palestinians. And so Palestinians and Muslims say, well, where are the American moderates? Where's the moral consistency on the other side? And so there's a problem that I think goes both ways. But generally speaking, with respect to your question, I think since 9/11, American Muslims in this country have done a pretty good job in terms of condemning acts of violence. And I can cite, and if you send me an email, and I often get this question, I'll send you an email, send me the document, send me the links, and no one actually sends me the email because, I don't know, maybe I've convinced them in the answer, but if you send me an email, I'll give you a list of organizations with links and statements of condemnation by American Muslim political leaders, both in this country and in the Middle East, who have spoken out. So the other thing that I would add is that, let's also remember that most Muslims, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, don't live in free and open democratic societies. I don't have any expectations for someone living under Gaddafi's Libya, for example, or in the Islamic Republic of Iran right now. They don't have the opportunity to speak out. If they do speak out, they'll get clobbered. So I think we should assess the ability of people to speak out to the extent that they're living in a free and open society. So I would hold, in that sense, North American Muslims much more to a higher standard, because you're living in a free democratic society. The state is not going to, arrest you at night. And so I think that is another dimension to the problem. To the extent that people have the freedom to speak out, then we should judge them on those grounds. And if they're not speaking out, then I think they need to be held to account.